Alrighty. Tumtum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. We're on chapter 6. Things get bad before they get better. But just a reminder to you that this is the first of like 6 Tumtum and Nutmeg stories, big long books, and they are in every single one of them. So even though things get a little dicey here, it's going to work out, okay? So chapter 6, the Nutmouses spent the day at Nutmouse Hall lying low. Nutmeg polished the great oak staircase, which took her mind off things a little, and Tumtum dozed in the library, which took his mind off things too. Then there was game pie for supper, and afterward, Tumtum read Nutmeg an article in the Mouse Times about lady mice in London having their fur dyed blonde. It made her laugh so much that she got the hiccups. Oh, Tumtum, she said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Oh, I do feel so much better. After all, things could be much worse. And Ivy might have moved the dresser, and that really would have been the end of Nutmouse Hall. Quite so, Tumtum agreed. She's had a good poke around at our gates, and she obviously didn't realize what they were. Our sign must have been too small for her to read. I doubt she'll look under the dresser again. By tomorrow, the whole thing will probably have blown over. Feeling much more cheerful, Nutmeg settled down to do some knitting, and Tumtum decided to read more of the novel he was in the middle of, which was about pirate mice. He got up to find his jacket, knowing the book to be in his pocket, but he looked in the library and the hall and the back room and the bedroom and the bathroom and the dressing room and the living room and the ballroom and the billiard room and every other room, and the jacket wasn't there. That's odd, he thought, trying to remember where he had last had it. Then he struck a paw to his forehead. Oh dear, he'd taken it off last night while they were having their midnight feast in the dollhouse. He would have to go back to look for it, as it had his wallet in it as well as his special box. He returned to the kitchen looking rather sheepish. I must go tonight, Nutmeg, he said. If the children find it, they might take things out of the pockets. Nutmeg looked at him anxiously. But what if Aunt Ivy's still on the prowl, she said. If I keep in the shadows, she won't see me, Tumtum replied. I'll be there and back in 5 minutes. We will be there and back in 5 minutes, Nutmeg said firmly, for she was not letting her husband out on his own. Tumtum would have argued, but he saw his wife's expression and he knew there was no point. Okay, then there's a pause. At 11 o'clock, remember the little sign that means, oh, we're going to change time or place. At 11 o'clock, the mice set out. After the dramatic morning, a peace had descended on Rose Cottage. The lights were off and nothing was stirring. And when they reached the hall, they could hear the sound of Aunt Ivy's soft snoring carrying through the living room door. Tumtum was carrying a strong flashlight so as to avoid the mouse traps. As well as the 2 in the kitchen, they passed 1 in the hall and 3 on the upstairs landing. Nutmeg looked at them contemptuously. If you look at something contemptuously, you're looking down on it. You think it's silly and ridiculous. She wanted to attach a rude note to one, but Tumtum wouldn't let her. When they got up to the attic, the children were deeply asleep. On entering the dollhouse, Tumtum found his jacket where he had left it hanging on the wooden peg in the back of the kitchen door. He put it on hurriedly, patting the pockets to make sure everything was in its place. An instinct told him to go straight back to Nutmouse Hall, but Nutmeg was looking longingly at her mop and pail. I don't think I've ever looked longingly at a mop before. Oh, Tumtum, Aunt Ivy's fast asleep, so surely there can't be any harm in my doing 1 or 2 little chores now that we're here. Tumtum looked uneasy. There was no knowing when Aunt Ivy might wake up, and given her mood this morning, he felt that this was no time for them to be at large, but Nutmeg was so eager, he hadn't the heart to drag her away. Oh, come on, Tumtum, she said, seeing him hesitate. Aunt Ivy never comes up here. Anyway, I won't be long. I'll just mop Lucy's shoes and dust the bedside tables and darn a sock or 2. She straightened up her apron strings behind her back and fetched the mop and pail from behind the door. You sit down and have a little something to eat, she said bossily. We know that's not a good idea, don't we? Sometimes it's hard in books when we know something that the characters don't know. You want to kind of stop them, right? Tumtum weakened. The thought of a little something to eat always mellowed him. He scrutinized the meal left out on the kitchen table of the dollhouse. It wasn't the usual old shortbread. Tonight the crumbs were brown and creamy, quite different. He sniffed the plate and his face lit up. It's chocolate, dear, he said delightedly. They must have bought it with the money we gave them. There were few things Tumtum loved more in the world than chocolate. Oh, do you like chocolate? I do. Oh. But since Nutmeg worried that it made him fat, she seldom allowed him any. Are you sure you won't join me, dear? He asked, licking his lips greedily. No, no, Tumtum, she said. You sit down and eat. I'll get on with things. And then she happily scurried off to start scrubbing. Tumtum sat down at the dollhouse table where the place had been laid. Then he took his novel out of his jacket pocket, put on his spectacles, and opened it to the middle of chapter 7, where his bookmark was. He didn't know what he was looking forward to more, tasting chocolate again or finding out what happened when the pirate mice stormed the water rat's barge. He decided to do both things at once. He laid the book on the table by his place and he started to read. Engrossed, Tumtum reached a paw towards the plate, and then he raised a great dollop of chocolatey crumbs towards his lips, and we want to just like reach out and stop him, right? He's using the visualize strategy. He's picturing what's happening in the book as he's reading it. Do you do that? He swallowed a mouthful of crumbs, then automatically reached out for more. Oh, we don't want him to do that, do we? Tumtum raised his paw back to his mouth and bolted down more of the chocolate, but this time he noticed that it tasted odd, and then quite suddenly his arms began to shake and he saw his book drop to the floor. He was feeling very strange. Chapter 7. Tumtum could feel pain in his stomach as though he swallowed a piece of barbed wire, and then his head began to pound as if a hammer were being knocked back and forth in his skull. Nutmeg was on the top of the dresser when she heard him suddenly spluttering and gulping, and it gave her such a start she knocked over her pail of soapy water. She jumped to the floor like a cricket and hurled into the dollhouse by her husband's side. Oh, Tumtum was shaking. Nutmeg started thumping him on the back and pressed a glass of water to his lips. Poison, Nutmeg, he whispered, pointing to the fateful plate of chocolate. Mouse, and then his voice was swallowed by another violent fit of spluttering. Nutmeg felt a deep dread stabbing through her. Mouse poison? It couldn't be, she thought wildly, for she knew there was no worse horror. Tumtum slumped exhausted in his chair. He raised his face weakly towards the children's beds. Why would they have done this to us, Nutmeg? He asked gently. Surely we never did them any harm. Then his eyes became lusterless and his lids drooped. Nutmeg knew she must get him back to Nutmouse Hall at once before he lost consciousness. She put an arm beneath his shoulders and raised him to his feet. Come on, Tumtum, she urged, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. We must get you home. You'll feel better when you're tucked in bed. But all the while, Nutmeg's mind was racing. The nearest mouse doctor, Dr. Goodmouse, lived nearly 2 miles away in the next village. You had to cross a ford and then climb a very steep hill to get there. It was a hard enough journey in fine weather, but even the fittest mouse would be reckless to undertake it in the snow. She would have taken any risk for Tumtum's sake, but if she perished in the journey, then he would have no one to look after him at all. Besides, she knew that when it came to poison, there was generally little a doctor could do. It always took several days for the poison to work its way through a mouse's body. Then there was no medicine that could stop its course. Let's see, Nutmeg prayed that he had only consumed a small mouthful, but then he did so gobble his food. Her fear deepening, she guided Tumtum inch by inch across the floor, and then she supported him as they stumbled together down the attic steps. But by the time they came to the main stairs, he was so weak that Nutmeg had to slide him down the trim wrapped in her apron and then virtually carry him across the kitchen floor to Nutmouse Hall. Okay, remember, it's getting bad. It's going to be okay. Okay? He was too exhausted to climb upstairs to his bedroom, so Nutmeg made a nest for him in the living room on the chaise lounge. A chaise lounge is one of those, it looks like a chair, like an upholstered chair, a soft chair. It has the back, but then instead of sitting at it, you lay your legs out. So it has a long, it's kind of like a mix between a couch and a chair almost. It's a chaise lounge. Let's see. He tossed and turned all night. Nutmeg pressed a glass of water to his lips, but he seemed unable to swallow. You're going to be all right, Tumtum, she kept saying to him, but she didn't feel at all sure. And then we have another pause. For the next 5 days, Nutmeg barely left her husband's bedside. His condition did not show signs of improving, and any glimmers of hope were short-lived. On Sunday afternoon, his temperature suddenly went down, but by midnight it was up again higher than before. Most of the time he was delirious. One morning he asked Nutmeg to send a telegram to his mother, who had died before they were married, and the next evening he suddenly sat up, hurled a glass across the room, shouting, "Out, out," as if he imagined someone having broken in. Nutmeg had never seen him like this. Tumtum was usually such a calm and mellow mouse, and she found his fits terribly unnerving. Let's see. As the hours ticked by, Nutmeg started to brood, clutching her husband's paw. She couldn't stop thinking of the children's betrayal. How could they have done something so dreadful? What had she and Tumtum done to incur such hatred? All we did was try and make the attic more comfortable, she thought mournfully. Surely they couldn't have objected to that. Somehow, Nutmeg suspected that Aunt Ivy must have something to do with it, and yet Aunt Ivy never could have known that she and Tumtum were making use of the dollhouse unless the children had told her so, and why would they do that? Nutmeg felt quite weak trying to make sense of it all. Since adopting Arthur and Lucy, she had felt for the first time that her family was complete, and the thought that they had turned on her made her feel quite brokenhearted. Since Tumtum had been taken ill, all the excitement and bustle had gone out of her. She was quite a different mouse than she had been before. The night stole away, and still she brooded, feeling too overwrought to sleep. If only I had some sewing to do, she thought longingly, for sewing always took her mind off things. But she had left her sewing basket in the dollhouse. She looked at her watch. It was after midnight. Everyone will be fast asleep, she thought. I don't suppose there could be any harm in going to get it. At once feeling a little better for having a sense of purpose, she fetched the flashlight from the kitchen and went to the front gate. The cottage was dark and still, and no one was stirring. She crept through the kitchen and into the hall, and then cocked an ear at the living room door and heard Aunt Ivy snoring. Feeling bolder, she went upstairs. The moon was shining in the attic window, and Nutmeg could see the children's heads asleep on their pillows. A part of her longed to get close to them and to brush their hair again with her broom, and yet for the first time she felt wary. If you feel wary, you're like a little nervous about it. The room looked dusty and neglected, for it had been more than a week since she'd last cleaned. The dollhouse had been untouched since she and Tumtum's last visit, and it had a sad, abandoned feel to it. Tumtum's book was still on the kitchen floor where he'd dropped it, and her sewing basket was where she always left it, in the cupboard under the stairs. I must get straight home, she thought, tucking the basket under her arm. If Tumtum comes too, he'll wonder where I am. She hurried out of the dollhouse, carefully closing the front door behind her, and then picked her way across the attic floor over a pile of dirty socks. And she was about to rush back down the steps when some instinct made her shine her flashlight up toward the dresser, and she saw a letter propped against Lucy's hairbrush, and it was addressed to Nutmeg. Nervous it might be another trap, Nutmeg climbed up a pair of blue tights that was tumbling from the top drawer and went to investigate. She looked anxiously towards the children's beds and then unfolded the letter, spreading it out flat on the dresser. The writing was so big she had to take a step back in order to read it. Dear Nutmeg, we have missed you so much. Please come back. Arthur is very sorry that he told Aunt Ivy about how you visit us and how we leave you supper in the dollhouse, but he only said it by mistake, and he wouldn't have said it if he thought it would make you vanish. We wish you would come back and make Aunt Ivy vanish instead. Love, Arthur and Lucy. Nutmeg read it once, and she read it again, and she felt so overcome she had to sit down on the handle of Lucy's hairbrush to compose herself. At last, everything fell into place. If poor, impetuous Arthur had told Aunt Ivy that a fairy came and ate crumbs out of the dollhouse, then she might reasonably have suspected that his fairy was one of the mice she had seen on the landing, and then she must have crept up here at night with murderous intent. Nutmeg felt a great rush of relief as she realized that the children hadn't betrayed them after all. Oh, bless them, she thought. I knew that dreadful woman must have been behind it after all. She was anxious to get back to Tumtum, but she knew she must leave a reply. There was a red pencil lying on the far side of the dresser. She picked it up and held it with both arms, steadying it against her chest as she scrawled a hurried note on the back of the children's letter. Dear Arthur and Lucy, please do not think I have abandoned you. Now that your aunt knows our secret, it is more difficult for me to visit, but I am still thinking of you. Love, Nutmeg. And then Nutmeg added a very defiant P.S. I will make Aunt Ivy vanish. I promise. And she vowed to herself to keep that promise. I must get rid of her, she thought, feeling a sudden thrill of determination. And I will get rid of her. But how? She bounced down the attic steps, ran across the landing, slid down the banister, her mind whirring. She had magnificent visions of herself chasing a terrified Aunt Ivy down the garden path, snapping at her heels, and driving her away from Rose Cottage, never to return. In her excitement, she quite forgot that Aunt Ivy was several hundred times bigger than she was. Nutmeg's mind was still galloping as she crossed the hall and ran under the kitchen door. It was galloping so much that she didn't notice that a light had been turned on. We'll show her who's boss, Nutmeg thought as she sauntered jauntily across the floor. Tumtum will get better, and then we'll let her know who owns this place. She skirted a patch of grease in front of the cooker and then paused to look down her nose at one of the mouse traps. She was feeling quite extraordinarily ebullient. She's very, very happy. But then there was a shattering human scream, ah! And in that instant, Nutmeg saw the tips of Aunt Ivy's slippers in front of her nose, standing between her and the dresser. Nutmeg stopped dead in her tracks. She knew Aunt Ivy would do something dreadful, yet she felt unable to move. A dark shadow slowly began to engulf her as Aunt Ivy's arms rose upward, and then there was a rapid blur as a teapot came hurtling through the air toward her. It smashed to the floor millimeters from Nutmeg's feet. Millimeters are those itty little bits on the ruler. Millimeters from Nutmeg's feet, sending splinters of china ricocheting all around. Senseless with panic, she hurled right over Aunt Ivy's slippers and ran straight under the dresser with her sewing basket swinging wildly back and forth on her arm. Oh, what a fool I am. Oh, what a fool, she thought as she wrenched open the gates. Now she knows where we live. She'll be back for us again. She'll pull out the dresser. She'll find Nutmouse Hall. No sooner had Nutmeg turned the key in the padlock when a fierce shaft of light shone on her. Aunt Ivy was on the floor, shining her flashlight directly at her. Nutmeg threw herself back from the gate out of sight, but it could make little difference now. Aunt Ivy knew where they lived. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, next chapter is chapter 8. I'm going to show you the first picture in chapter 8. Oh, look at that woman. I don't like where this is going, but I know it's going to turn out okay.